Hey everyone, how's it going? Andrew here, and I just quickly wanted to say I really appreciate you tuning into the show and glad that you're getting helpful information and insight from the interviews that we have with the guests and everything that we do here. But I also wanted to let you know that if you find you could use a little bit more guidance, know that I'm here to help in a couple of ways. I would start by just visiting rengenmarketing.com. That's my website. And once you're there, you can either scroll down the page to sign up for my email newsletter, where I provide free tips and impactful ideas on creating awareness for your game, or you could just go to the navigation menu at the top that says Let's Chat. Share with me what type of problems you're facing, and that allows us to kind of discuss in a greater capacity what type of guidance or help that you're looking for. So in either case, I just wanted to let you know that I'm here to help beyond what the podcast can provide for you. So again, really appreciate you tuning in regularly and hope that you're getting the most that you possibly can out of the show. But if you need a little bit more help and guidance, you know how else you can get in contact with me. So thanks again for being such great listeners, and now let's get to the show. Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'm going to be your host today, and this is episode 266, where we're going to be talking about knowing your pain points and solutions. All right, let's face it. We all have our pain points, especially when it comes to marketing. Oftentimes, identifying these pain points can be a challenge, and working through them can quickly become overwhelming. Thankfully, our guest, Mike Gamble of Talenthouse Media Foundry, shares his thoughts on these important topics to better identify what areas need attention and determine the right solutions to take action with. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey, everybody, and welcome back. Happy to have you here. And for those of you who are thinking that my voice is off a little bit, it is because it is. I had a little bit of a cold, but hey, that's not going to stop us today because we have a great and amazing guest here with us today, which is Mike Gamble. Mike, how's it going, bud?
It's going great. Thank you very much. Yeah, rather well.
Awesome. Well, we're totally glad to have you. Mike is here from, well, you know what? I'm just going to give the reins to you. Tell us why you're here, who you're with, what kind of cool stuff you're doing. And then after you've given us that introduction, take a moment and just share a little bit about maybe some insight to your personal life in terms of what you're doing outside of work.
Cool. Yeah, so I'm with a company called Talenthouse over in the UK. We're multinational. I'm building a platform for them called Media Foundry, which is basically an ecosystem for, in the first instance, independent games developers. The idea being to allow indie game devs access to resources they don't have within their studios. So typically, a small indie dev, 6 to 12 people, whatever, doesn't necessarily have a biz dev guy, doesn't necessarily have a dedicated marketing person, doesn't have maybe project management or budget management. So what the proposition is, we can help games developers be more successful, indie devs, by giving them access to the resources and skills that they don't currently have within their studio, so they don't have to actually go out and recruit or try and learn it themselves. Because typically, if you're a great gameplay designer, why should you be a good marketeer?
Yeah, and it's great because it addresses a lot of, I think, pain points and other things that like a lot of these teams and studios have and stuff. And we're definitely going to get into that some more too. Sure. But before we do that, I'd love for you to share too, like, what you do in your spare time when you're not so busy helping indie devs.
Okay, so clearly I play a lot of video games. It would be kind of stupid otherwise. But I also, I show jump. I have a horse.
Oh, sweet.
I have a couple of motorcycles, so it could sound a bit of an adrenaline junkie from that point of view, and a couple of dogs as well. So, walking the dogs, that kind of stuff. So I try and do a lot of things which are not related to my day-to-day job, though video games clearly are. But I sit in front of a screen for most of the day, so when I relax, I like to be out and about doing something a bit more physical.
Nice. Well, it definitely sounds like a lot of fun, and thank you for sharing that with us. But before we get into our discussion today, which I'm really excited about, I want to have you go through the Q box round. And for those of you who are aren't familiar, it's just a series of random questions that we have prepared here from Mike, and just to get to know him a little bit more. So, Mike, are you ready for the Q box round?
Totally.
All right. If you could listen to only one song for an entire day, what would it be?
It would be Billy Bragg's Between the Wars.
Ah, okay. Now, considering the time of the year, which is winter right now at the time of this recording, sledding or tubing?
I have no idea what tubing is, so I've got to say sledding.
You know what? I was wondering if that could be that you might ask that. So tubing is specifically, I think, originated from people would use giant inner tubes from like trucks, and
Sure,
since then
yeah.
it's now like basically a flotation device that people will use to in place of a sled or toboggan.
Well, it sounds kind of fun, actually. So, yeah, let's go change it. Let's go tubing.
All right, I love that. What's one habit you have that has contributed to your success?
I guess being open and friendly.
Nice. What's your childhood favorite game?
Okay, so I'm a little bit older than you, so we didn't have video games in my day, but I played a lot of board games, and I think Risk.
Oh, I haven't played Risk in forever, and I love that game. To
It's
the
awesome.
point of like borderline obsession. And then my friends stopped wanting to play anything with me because they're like, "Stop, dude! Just come on.
Yeah.
You got other things to do. You can't just want to play Risk all the time." Okay. And last but not least, staple here on the show is, what game are you playing now?
Okay, so I'm playing The Ascent on Xbox Series X.
Nice, nice. All right, cool. Well, hey, thank you so much for going through the Q box round. It's really great to get to know you a little bit more, and how adventurous you are. I'm not surprised you chose tubing, because considering all the other stuff that you like to do in your hobbies, that's tubing sounded like is right up your alley. So that was just great. So thank you.
Pleasure.
All right, so now we're going to get into our core discussion here, and that is today knowing your pain points and solutions. So, what I thought would be really cool with this particular topic is, as you know, Mike nicely introduced himself earlier in the types of services he provides to indie devs and his team. Obviously, there's a huge breadth of what could be helpful, and in some cases there might be some things that might not be as helpful as other things. And I know a lot of the times too, at face value, for you who are listening now, that you might have an idea of what a problem is, but you might not necessarily know what it is, or you're scratching the surface of it. So that's really what this is about, and that's why I thought Mike would be such a great person to have this conversation with, and identifying the pain points in terms of how it relates to your marketing. So to kick off this discussion, Mike, at a high level, what do you think? What would you say is the main problem you find indie games have with their marketing?
It's twofold. I think one of them is recognizing the need to market and market early. I've seen it so many times where really talented teams have created a game in the belief that build it and they will come, which
Right.
Clearly is not ever going to work nowadays. And then also, and so it's recognizing you need to market, and recognizing that you're going to need a budget to market.
Mm.
And that's possibly the hardest bit, especially when you're kind of bootstrapping your business. You've mortgaged your house, or you put your life savings into it as a team. You want to spend all of that money building a kick-ass game, but actually you need to ring fence some of that money to make it, to market it, so that you can actually then sell your game.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, yeah, I mean, let's face it, these are at face value like pretty two main pain points that a lot of people face on a regular basis. So, and while I think that's important, and while it might seem obvious, herein lies like where I want to dig in a little bit more in terms of like discovering pain points and what exactly those are. Because, I mean, let's face it, we could all probably all market yesterday and all have money to do it with, right? I mean, anyone is going to be in the same boat. So let's dig in a little bit further. So indie games and dev teams are, constantly facing challenges with their marketing. So what do you feel are effective ways to discover the root of their marketing pain points?
I think an effective way is, again, as early as possible in the project, building what you consider to be an early marketing plan and finding the holes in it, and actually having perhaps somebody who's not so connected with the game at a development level, so not so emotionally invested in the game, to take a look at that plan and say, well, hold it, that doesn't work, that's great, so kind of like a reality check.
Yeah I think that's a good point too, because a lot of times, like, the developers or the team, they're so immersed in the work and what they're doing that it's always hard to kind of get that high level view or get outside of the things and really be able to consider like other options. And I mean, let's face it, even outside of games, like businesses and everybody has this problem because if they're so immersed with the work and everything. So identifying that need is definitely really important. And I think it's one of the things that kind of hinders them kind of from discovering if they don't think it's to think in that mindset or have that perspective.
I think that's exactly it. And I think it becomes, the smaller you are as a team, the harder that becomes to step outside of, that kind of blinkered view that you have. And blinkered, it's not a criticism, because that's the view you have to take to build a game, to concentrate on your project. But it makes it harder to then take a look at it objectively from a different place.
Right. And I'm glad you made that point too, because, of course it comes up with like balancing and all those things in terms of like focusing on marketing and balancing between your game. But at the core of it, I mean, it's not necessarily chicken or egg, because without the game, there wouldn't be marketing, essentially. Right. So it's a good way to look at things. And still, I know there's beliefs in terms of like where the percentage should lie or how much balance and stuff. At the core, it's about the game.
Totally. Yeah.
Plain and simple.
Yeah. So if you haven't got a good game, if you haven't got a game, you can't market it. Exactly what you said.
Cool. Well, another thing that I think is important from a pain point perspective is, emotions can, be a large component in contributing to pain points. So what's a good way for devs to look at their pain points with clarity and not be muddled by their emotion?
And that's hard. And it gets harder the further into the project you get, I think. Because if you are emotionally invested, of course you are, especially amongst indie devs, because you're not bankrolled in any way by a big publisher or anybody, frankly. And so emotions are high. And so again, I think it's a case of being able to take the team out of their normal environment, even virtually, to discuss the game, to maybe have outside input into the game, to kind of take the pressure off a bit, so that people's emotions don't run high or don't run as high, and allow you to look objectively at, the game, what you're going to do with marketing. And this isn't just something around marketing. It's actually a good practice for development, because when you're building features in a game, you get very married to them. If you're a gameplay designer, you get very emotional about it. It's natural. It's you would not be doing this if you weren't passionate about your craft, but that's a double-edged sword.
Right. So I guess one way to look at this too is trying to approach things with an objective lens. And it's not to say, because again, it's probably the hard part is just like not necessarily balance, but finding ways to do that, because at the same token, it's also important to have that level of passion and focus and everything else, or even that like emotion aspect in the development. So
Yeah, so at the risk of sounding sort of beating my own drum, or our services, I mean, that's kind of what we're supplying, with the skills to back it up. So we're giving the ability to look in on your project objectively, communicate that with you in a less emotional fashion, and giving you and your team that opportunity to kind of step out a little bit and look at the results of what somebody else is saying.
Yeah, and that in itself, I think, as you kind of either alluded or mentioned to before, is really helpful, because, as you said, the further you get along into development, the harder it is to kind of like somewhat, not necessarily detach, but to remove yourself temporarily
Yeah.
and then kind of like steer yourself in the correct course. Because if you go down a particular path and you're too far down that path, sometimes you can't necessarily, backstep or change course or
You
whatever.
don't have the time, you don't have the money. There's also a number of factors that come into play, and that just makes it hard. The further down the line you are, the much harder it is to change anything about the game, marketing or design or art or any of that. So
Great. So why don't we now shift a little bit? We identified some like pain points, ways to discover them, and kind of like some maybe ideas on how people can kind of maybe do a quick little reality check, if you will, or self-assessment. Now, once those things are identified, I think obviously the next step is obviously working towards a solution. So once that happens, what would you say are good ways indie devs can look for an ideal solution to their marketing problems?
I think one way is to take a look at the market, look at their competitors, look at what other teams similar to them have done that are successful teams. So spend some time on I guess what is effectively market research amongst their peers within games development. See what's been successful, see what hasn't been successful. Obviously, another way is to bring in professionals. Again, beating my own drum. But I do think you need a developer needs to, again, have looked at the market in which they're going to be operating and see what's been successful and what hasn't been successful in the past. Because then that will give at least some good hints and some good sketch out of the sorts of paths they can follow and ways of solving some of those pain points, solving some of those marketing challenges in a sort of timely and cost-effective manner as well, because it's all very well to throw huge heaps of money at it, but no indie game developer has huge heaps of money to throw at problems. They need to be smart about it.
Right, exactly. Like it's funny. I remember a while back I was having some car work done, and I was asking questions about the potential issue at hand, and the mechanic, and I think I use this analogy in some of my own writing, was basically said, well, you can't just throw parts at the problem if you don't know what it is.
Then that's exactly it.
And that's one point too. So that's why I think this whole process of finding the ideal solution is important, because hey, like we said, if you had unlimited amounts of funds, you could do whatever you want, but still at the end of the day, even if you had all that, wouldn't you want to lead with something that's effective and not just noisy?
Exactly. Yeah.
There was another point I wanted to bring up, but because that you made, but that's fine. It will come back to me if it's important. But now now that we have a better understanding of this ideal solution and how to kind of identify what it is, what type of resources should indie devs trust when learning more about their ideal solution?
Okay, so I mean, there's a massive websites which are trustworthy, and a massive community resources which are trustworthy. So within indie game development, there's a lot. I mean, one of the ones which is one of the best ones actually, and has been for 20 years or so, is I'm not sure, I think they're called Game Developer now, but
Yep.
it was Garment Sutra.
Yep. You're right. Yep.
They've been there forever, and they've and constantly provide non flashy information, for want of a better word. The content there is always good, and it's always interesting, and it's always got a lot of other developers talking about how they've done things across the board, not just marketing, but actually nuts and bolts dev. So I think that's a go-to straight away. But I think community is another great one to go to. Indie devs are very well connected to each other, and so they will know other devs that have launched their titles, and so just talking to them about what worked and what didn't is a great way of getting a feel for what they need to do. Now, once they've got an idea, then they can go out and find who can execute that for them. Our services is one way of doing it, but there's PR agencies, there's marketing people. It all depends how they want to work. But again, in games industry is small, so it's easy to find out the reputation of anybody that's providing services, and whether they're trustworthy, whether they do a good job. All these sorts of things are not hidden too deeply within the industry.
Right. And I will willingly give you a little plug here for Foundry, Media Foundry, because there are a lot of like tools and resources there. And from what I understand, you actually go ahead and like anything that's like the content that's produced there, you vet yourself, you read everything that goes
Absolutely.
live. So you have that lens. And not only that, I've went through some of it myself, really helpful stuff. I'm trying to remember the section of the site where it has stats too. So, and I think you even on the site address like potential questions like, what is the validity of this? It's like, hey, all the source and information here has been checked and everything, and pride yourself in doing what you can to make sure it's absolutely up to date. But now that I gave you that plug, why don't you tell us a little bit more about those resources? Because those are all things I respect and do like what you've put together there.
Okay, so mediafoundry.io is the site. It's free. And it is aimed as resources for indie devs, and it's got articles. It's probably about 14 or 15 articles, maybe a few more now, which cover all aspects of game dev, marketing, and the industry itself. And they range in topics from kind of quite simplistic for somebody who maybe is literally just starting their journey. So there's a fairly simplistic article about engines and engine choice and what might be suitable for your game. So for somebody starting down the road, that could be useful. For a more experienced dev, that's possibly not something that they'd be that interested in. We have some kind of opinion pieces about a good one is we've got two kind of opposing pieces. One is the metaverse, best thing that's ever happened to games, and the other one is the metaverse, this is horrific, worst thing that's ever happened to games. And so there's that kind of opposing argument, and we like to do that because we have an opinion. We're not just kind of reposting news or whatever. We have an opinion about how games should be made, about how indie devs should be treated, well. The idea, the whole point of Talenthouse is it's for independent creators of all media, and it gives them a fair crack of the whip. It gives them fair payment. It's supposed to be a very ethical platform generally, and Media Foundry is very ethical in the games bit. So we have all these articles about a whole variety of game development topics. We have a stats tool, which we call the Furnace.
That's it.
Which basically scrapes Steam data and allows a developer to kind of hone in on games which are similar to what they're building and how they've reviewed, how they've performed, MAUs, CCUs, a whole bunch of data about how successful a game has been. So if I'm thinking about building a science fiction RTS, I can go on the Furnace and probably find, well, maybe even hundreds, but certainly a good 50 similar games over the last 10 years and look at how they performed. And we think this is really really useful because of you don't want to place all your bets on a genre or a title which is in a crowded market, or you if you're up against Skyrim, for instance, if you're building an RPG and you've got a small budget and your main competitor is Skyrim, then you've got to find some pretty neat ways of differentiating yourself.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
that's the furnace. And then we also have a twice yearly market research report, which is delivered via video, which is kind of more about consumer trends, what consumers are playing, what the drop off has been since COVID, since lockdowns have ended. Obviously there has been a drop in game playing, but actually it's not been that serious compared. We're still on an upward curve. So all of that kind of information, which then allows a developer to get a little bit more insight into the consumer market they're going to operate in, which platforms are more successful, which genres sit within each platform more successfully, that kind of info. And so it's all designed really to give a kind of big bunch of very useful information to a games developer that they can keep coming back, dipping into. New articles are released every week, covering new topics and more topics. And so it's meant to be a useful resource for game devs.
Yeah. So like we were talking about before, there's a lot of different sources out there. And as far as I could tell, and you giving this in the description and everything that entails, definitely another trusted source to consider when looking at stuff. Because let's face it, there's lots of information, and sometimes you could also get information overload. So that's a good central place that has a little bit of everything that you would need depending on what your objective is and what you're looking for. And ultimately just trying to find a way to determine what is going to be the ideal solution.
Yeah.
So to kind of wrap up this segment here, once the right solution is identified, and I think this is an important one that people really need to consider too, to a degree, I guess. What level of investment, and when I say investment, I'm thinking more in terms of types of resources, should indie devs consider to be fully committed to that solution?
How do you mean? Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's all right. So what I'm thinking in terms of, let's say I need help with social media marketing, for example, and just fill in the blank with anything. What level of commitment is there? A level of commitment on me, or is it going to be the studio, as a developer, like either just a basic understanding, or like, so how involved are they going to be in the process in terms of they find the solution, someone's going to perform a service for them? How involved are they going to be with that solution?
With social media, I think they need to be reasonably involved because social media is very much the voice of the studio. So you've got to make sure whoever is representing you or doing your social media outreach is accurately representing the voice of the studio and the voice of the game. So there needs to be a quite close relationship there, so that you are being reflected correctly. So in some respects, that's probably one of the more resource intensive, routes to go, just because you need to make sure that you are being represented right.
Okay, so let's take another example. Let's say, and maybe two actually. Let's say, quick one, PR or influencer outreach.
Sure. So that's much easier to kind of brief and hand off almost, because of it's sort of much more of a known science, I suppose. There's teams, including ours, that are expert in those areas, have the contacts, have that ability to reach out to games media across the board. And so as long as they are briefed correctly about the game, about the studio, about the vision, and also given the right resources in terms of assets, screenshots, videos, whatever, then that is almost a sort of brief, pull the trigger kind of relationship. And obviously there'll be regular check back, but that's something that you can absolutely hand off and not be too worried about it, and just have a check-in, once a week or whatever the cadence needs to be.
Okay. No, great. And thanks for providing those like two examples or describing on kind of what that arrangement would be. Now, and just to kind of wrap this part up, I'm curious, regardless of the level of involvement, whether it's very involved like social media or not so involved, would you ever advise either a developer or a studio to kind of go fully just hands off with something, or should they keep at least a pulse?
No, you should never go completely hands off, because that's disaster in the making, isn't it? Really, I think there needs to be a tight working relationship, and an understanding, a meeting of minds almost, so that you can feel confident in the people you're trusting and let them get on with it. But you definitely need to have that check back. You can't just, and I don't think anybody would want to be just given it and said, right, go off you go and do
Right.
it. We're not interested anymore. I don't see that happening.
But I think the point you touched on most importantly is just having that line of communication,
Yeah,
because there's only, regardless of whatever service provider and what they do, there's only so much they can understand and fully grasp the concept of the game, of the voice, like things that you shared about before too. And it goes vice versa with the developer or the studio. There's only so much they might understand about what's happening, why it needs to happen, those types of things. So as you mentioned too, the communication, but also the partnering. It actually is a partnership that's
it is.
happening there, because if that breakdown occurs, then like you said, it could be disastrous, it could be a mess, and those are all things that no one wants to deal with.
Exactly. There needs to be trust. And the other part of that is it needs, the marketing effort needs to start way earlier than most developers realize. You should be thinking about this stuff, because you can market your game, from almost day one, because, with production blogs and developer blogs, you can be talking about pre-production and concept art and stuff. You can start building hype really early,
Yep.
and only going to stand you in good stead, as long as you're not Star Citizen and you go on for 10 years developing the same game. Not sure if we're allowed to say that, but whatever. But you know what I mean.
Yeah.
You need to be in a position to start pretty early, so that you're in a really good place when you release the game.
Yep.
Because as we know, indie devs tend to live on some pretty crowded platforms when they release their games, and discoverability is just the most difficult thing.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with you, because the way I see it is if you start now, whenever that might be, or but if you start now, then you're gonna be in a better position and have more opportunities than you would have if you didn't.
Yeah, exactly. And who doesn't want to be successful? Who doesn't want to make their game successful?
Right.
Yeah.
All right, so now we're about to close here, but before we do, I wanted to talk about lessons learned, and from your experience, what are some of the pitfalls you see that most indie devs make with their marketing? And I have a feeling I know what it is.
Well, the biggest one, come back to it, is just not really doing any, or leaving it so late that it can't possibly make a splash. It can't, it makes no impact on the market. Also, being smart about where they spend their money. I've seen some devs spend money on marketing initiatives like events, which are just clearly not a good use of money. There's good ways of getting market recognition, and there's some pretty shitty ways of getting it. And you don't want to spend your money in the wrong place.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something I share with you as well, is just like, do the extra legwork. If you're really thinking about something, and kind of like what we discussed already, at least double check on it. If you're for whatever reason you're big on going to an event, for whatever that your idea behind that is, find out, talk to other people who went. What did they get for results? Like,
Yeah.
And don't just limit it to devs, because even getting different perspectives can be helpful too.
Exactly. And I guess one massive bit of advice would be hit up the engine providers. If you're using an engine, Unity, Unreal, they do massive amounts of marketing, and they have lots of events where they have devs hosted. if you don't ask, you don't get. So
Right.
you know, check out those avenues too.
Yeah, that's a good one. I think oftentimes, I mean, you hear it come up, but I don't think it doesn't get the same exposure or appeal, I guess, as the other more well-known events, whether they're bigger consumer ones or business-related ones, or even just Steam as a whole. I mean, Steam, I think, is always on everybody's forefront in terms of events, but
Yeah.
those types, the engine ones, I think, the, from my from what I gather, it don't seem to be as top of on people's radars as they could be possibly. So.
No, exactly. But you know, any exposure is good.
All right. So as we close, and I know you probably shared some, so whether you wanted to emphasize them a little bit more, could you list like maybe 3 actionable suggestions or tips that you would recommend for people listening today?
Yeah. First off, wherever you are in your dev, but as early as possible, get a kind of health check. Get a check on marketing. Think about what your marketing's going to be, and have somebody else look at that and say, well, that makes no sense, or yeah, that's great, or you know, whatever. I think that's one. I think the second one is to make sure you put aside some money for it. You know, it's the more money you have for marketing, the better place you're going to be. You can be really smart with little amounts of money,
Mm-hmm.
but you at least need to have something put aside. You can't rely on marketing for free, really, unless you have the next big thing, which you know is impossible to know anyway. So
Right.
you have to put some budget aside. And then I think the third one is don't be afraid to ask. If you don't have those skills in-house, and there is no reason why you should have those skills in-house, then go find them somewhere else. You know, take on me, take on my group. No, but you know, there are groups like mine out there. There's individuals as well. You know, subcontract, consult. You know, there's lots of resources. Don't fall into the trap of just because you are brilliant at games development, you're going to be brilliant at everything else.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting that you said? I like that point too, because recently I've been conducting some surveys and stuff, and a lot of dev information coming back kind of paints a tone where they have this idea or that they can't achieve or get some of these things, and I think it is founded. Your tip here is basically the solution in that feeling, which is, you know, just ask or maybe look into it more, because there's this idea behind it where if I have this, I can't get this, but it's not necessarily the case if you're not asking the right questions or asking questions to begin with.
Exactly. Be open-minded about it.
Yeah.
I think is what it comes down to.
So I think that's a great one. Don't be afraid to ask. I mean, they're all great, but that one's the kicker, because I think that can just reveal so much more than you probably would have ever expected.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Mike, I really appreciate the time that you spent with us today, sharing a little bit more about, you know, how to identify these pain points, what are good solutions, and of course, sharing more about excuse me, Talenthouse, Media Foundry, because again, that's another great resource. So if people listening today want to get either in touch with you or find out more about Talenthouse, what are some links? What are some ways they can do that?
Okay, so they can email me direct, actually, mike@talenthouse.com. That's a pretty easy one to remember. There's the main Talenthouse website, which is talenthouse.com, which is the whole of what the whole group offers. And then if they're specifically interested in Media Foundry, that's mediafoundry.io.
Sweet. Well, again, really appreciate you being on the show. You had some awesome insight to share with us. And yeah, I mean, keep doing what you're doing and helping serve the indie dev community.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. If you enjoy and value the show's content, you can support us even more by going to Patreon and visiting www.patreon.com/IGM podcast and select the tier that best suits your needs. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.